Hi, my name's John. I work at Career Plug. We are hiring. I'm not looking. Have not seen the movie Back to the Future, but I do think the posters with the flying car on it look pretty cool.
Hey, I'm Constantine. I work for a company called MyVest. We're in that financial space. I'm not looking for anybody yet, but we are looking for an office. So if you have any leads for an office space, I'll be looking to talk to you. And I am still waiting for the hoverboard.
Hi, my name is Constantine as well. I'm the original Constantine of this group. I mostly do system level software, and I'm a consultant. I'm available. I do site reliability engineering and performance and scalability. And my favorite Back to the Future scene is when Elon Musk shows Marty the Cybertruck. Elon Musk shows Marty the Cybertruck. You can Google it.
Okay.
Facetious. But I bet
It's an
somebody
actual
doctored
scene.
that. I bet somebody doctored that scene though. Okay. Okay.
I am Steven, and I am working for the University of Michigan remotely. I'm looking currently for like junior to mid-level web development job. And I haven't seen the movie, so no things.
Hey, I'm Mark. I work for a company called Doximity. I'm a web developer there. I'm not currently looking, but we are hiring like mid to senior level. And the only thing I remember from Back to the Future is, yeah, like he almost kisses his mom or something. That's like, I don't know.
Hi, I'm Cindy. I'm an engineering manager at a company called Grubhub. We are not currently hiring in Austin. I'm not currently looking, and my favorite Back to the Future moment is daylight savings.
I'm Ethan. I also work at Grubhub. As Cindy said, Cindy's my boss. Ethan's looking. So I'm not looking. Let's see. I've not seen Back to the Future, but my favorite scene is the Chuck Berry scene.
Hey, I'm Ross. I'm also from Grubhub. I don't know who these two are though. I'm visiting Cindy from San Francisco along with Ethan, who's based in Boston. And favorite Back to the Future scene that has been mentioned so far, the giant.
Hi, I'm Rachel. I may be the least programmer person in the room. I can play with your HTML and CSS, but I'm a UX product designer. I'm currently looking for mid-level roles, and in my past career, I was a toy designer. In terms of I'm going to say that outside of just the amazingness of the DeLorean, which any parade you go to where you happen to snag a DeLorean for that parade, best part of childhood. But that chalkboard scene where he straws a branch, like the first timeline, then a branch off it, was probably the first time in my life where the idea of multiple timelines was like expressly introduced.
Little known
Awesome.
fact, Ernest Cline, who wrote Ready Player One, lives here in Austin and drives the actual DeLorean, looking exactly like Back to the Future around Austin.
I think I've seen it like next to Trader Joe like 5 years ago.
Awesome trivia. For those of you who are here for the first time, I would be interested to know how you heard of the meetup. How come this is your first time? Maybe you moved, maybe we didn't do a good job marketing. So anybody here would like to volunteer why this is your first time here?
I found you guys last night actually looking for a group to get together. I'm kind of at the point, like I mentioned, where I'm looking to find some people who can push things we're working on forward. I looked for an Austin Rails group before. I don't know why this didn't come up, but I went on Facebook and found me on a group. It hadn't been updated in a while that you can go to Meetup, and I found it and
Okay.
just thrilled to find you on the night tonight.
I'm not on Facebook, so I have no idea what other group exists, but this is the oldest Ruby meetup in the US, I think. I mean, don't quote me on that 100%. It might be...
Citation.
Yeah, it needs citation. But according to what I've been told when I joined as an organizer, I've only been in Austin since 2015, but Damon, who used to organize this, if you ask people about Damon, they'll know who Damon is. No need to say more about him, apparently. But he, I guess 2006 is when he first started the group, or 2005, something like that. I think February 2006 was the 10-year anniversary, if I'm remembering correctly. Sorry, 2016 was the 10-year anniversary, which makes it 2006 when I first started. So yeah, anybody else? Any? Yeah.
I'm a digital nomad, so I do like 6 weeks in the city and then
Okay.
move on. And I got to Austin like a week ago,
Okay.
so I was searching on Meetup for Ruby, Rails, iOS meetups and stuff to meet local tech scene and stuff like that.
Awesome. Well, welcome. Yeah, so if you're curious, we meet the 4th Tuesday of every month for Austin on Rails, second Monday of every month for Austin RB, with exceptions of holidays like Thanksgiving and Christmas and March, South by Southwest. Just should be a holiday too. But since there are a bunch of people new here, I'll go back real quick to. Nope. This link. So refreshaustin.slack.com is the best way to connect with everybody. AustinRails.org will probably get you to all of the other links. So you can take a picture of this or remember whichever one is easiest for you to remember. So if you want to connect with everybody, this is the best way to do it. Also, are you ready?
Yeah.
All right. So there's swag. All those socks are not for the people sitting there. So feel free to come grab some pizza while Aaron gets ready.
Is there, do I need to use this to control the volume?
Yeah.
Okay. So I've turned it down once for my
Give it a second, when it goes back and sits.
Okay. Because I thought it was
You want the lights on or off?
Jeez, how many windows do I have?
Okay, we Rails. You want the lights on or off?
We don't mind.
Off?
Let everyone get cozy.
Here we go.
Oh, it's going in on the wrong screen. I need to figure out how to get the right screen. Give me one second.
So while he gets set up, we have 2 Justins, 2 Constantines. Anybody else catch duplicate names? Mikes?
Yeah, 2 mics.
2 mics sitting next to each other? All right, so Justin sitting next to each other, Constantine sitting next to each other. 2 Joes?
No, it's alright.
All right. How many do we need to create singularity?
3. We need 3 threes.
3 threes? One more thing. We are live streaming. We started a few minutes ago, midway through the intros. So if you're hiding from the FBI, you probably want to be behind that beam column right there. Just FYI.
Okay. My talk is called Back in Time, and you thought time travel was complicated.
Sooner or later, every programmer has to deal with time zones. And I can't really offer much advice here. I can offer a cautionary tale. I can tell you why you really should never, ever deal with time zones if you could help it.
That's a great video if you want to check it out. I just really like the intro because that is the impetus for this talk. If you've ever dealt with time zones, they are a pain. Let's get back to the basics though. The first thing I want to ask is how many time classes does Ruby have? Does anyone know? Okay, Nathan's right. There are 3.
3 factorial?
No, just 3. Like, oh my God, that's a lot of classes. We have the date class, which obviously represents a date. We have the time class, which deals with a moment in time, very specific. And then we have the date time class, which is this very odd subset of date, which adds the support for seconds, which sounds like time, but it kind of isn't. Also, I just lied to you. There are actually 4 time classes in Ruby.
That's what I said.
Core Ruby has a time class and the standard library extends it. So technically there are 2. You can follow those links to the docs. So time and date time, what's the point? There really isn't much of a difference except that the time class handles leap seconds and doesn't handle calendar reform. April 23rd is UNESCO's World Book Day because William Shakespeare and Miguel de Cervantes both died on April 23rd, 1616. However, unlike Spain, England would not adopt the Gregorian calendar until 1752. You can figure out what this means by using Ruby. If we set our variable shakes equal to the date of Shakespeare's death in England and servus to Cervantes' death on the Gregorian calendar, we'll find that if you subtract them, they're actually 10 days apart. How's that possible if they're both April 23rd, 1616? I kind of already gave it away via the Gregorian calendar. If you convert them to those dates, you'll see Cervantes did actually die on April 23rd, 1616. But Shakespeare died on May 3rd. TLDR, unless you're using historical context, use time. Date time is kind of just this extra thing that can handle funky calendar switchovers. Now what we're all here for, time zones. There are approximately 24 of them, but they're always making more every day. Actually, daylight saving is a time zone in and of itself. As of today, February 25th, we're in the Central Standard Time Zone, or CST, CT, or -6. On the 8th of next month, we'll switch to Central Daylight Time, CDT, -5. And Texas is so big that we actually span 2 of the US time zones. Over in Hudspeth in El Paso County, they're in Mountain Time and they're 1 hour earlier at MT -5. The one time zone you do absolutely have to know is UTC, which is Coordinated Universal Time. The reasons the letters don't line up is because it was made by the French. It's also known as Greenwich Mean Time and Zulu Time. Greenwich Mean is a historical one because that's where the mean solar time was observed at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, London. This is also where the prime meridian passes through the Earth. Zulu is the NATO phonetic pronunciation of the letter Z for 0 meridian, or the time at the 0 meridian. You've maybe seen it before because it's seen in ISO 8601 time, kind of like this for today's date. That's where the Z is. Time zones can affect your time class instances, and so it's very important to know the different time systems that your computer can represent. Your machine's time is system time. It changes when you change, or when the daylight saving changes around you. So if I were to fly to California, my machine's time would change as soon as it connects to the Apple time server. In most web applications, especially Rails, there are 3 time zones you should be aware of. There's the system time where the server is running, there's the application time, and there's the database time. In general, again, system time should only be changed as your local time changes. It's intended to reflect the time where your machine physically is located. System time is sort of you can think of it almost as the absence of a set time zone since you're not setting it yourself, especially since we started getting time servers that operating systems would sync up with. If you look at these calls to the time class, I'm creating instances of time, and by default, they're in the central time zone, or -6. They can be easily converted over to UTC, where you can see that if I were to convert midnight here on the 25th, or this morning, over to UTC, it's at 6 a.m., hence the 6 offset. You can actually specify the offset yourself as a string if you're interested, with a plus or minus hours and minutes format, like these over here. You can see that setting midnight in the central time zone and then converting it to UTC makes it 6 a.m. And then setting midnight in UTC doesn't really do anything when converted to UTC, but that's best practices, or Rubocop will yell at you if you don't chain on the .utc. Finally, system time can also be set via the environmental variable TZ. If we were to call up the time for today at midnight, you'd see over on the right-hand side that it's in Central Time. If I just set TZ equal to EST, or Eastern Standard Time, it jumps us over to -5. Application time is important because it's what time your application thinks it is in. It's a value that has some sort of meaning to your application, and you'll be best able to determine just what that is. It doesn't change by itself, which is important. If I were to set my Rails application, for example, to Central Daylight Time, when we switch over, or rather Central Standard Time, what we're in now, when we switch over to Central Daylight Time, my application's time will not change. It will always appear like it's an hour later within my application. The reason this is beneficial is because code change is required to alter it. This way you're not getting any odd surprises based on just what day it is or when the clocks have gone, or if your server, for some reason, is able to book a flight and cross time zones. So the important thing for us here at Austin on Rails is, how does Rails take care of this? Rails allows you to set the application's time very simply within your application RB file. The default is UTC, which, unless you have a really good reason, I wouldn't recommend changing it from, but should you, you just put in config.timezone and you give it its name. If you want to find out how Rails represents the time zones, you can just do rails tz.all or something like that, :all. It'll tell you all the names for the time zones, but you'll see some examples in here. It can then be access set and utilized from the time.zone method. This is an addition that Rails puts in on top of Ruby. For example, you can see time.zone.name is UTC, and if I do time.zone.now, it gives me the time approximately now. That's 7:30 here in Central Time over in UTC, which is 1:30 in the morning. If I set the time zone to Central Time, US and Canada, and then call for the time again, it'll give it to me back at 7:30, and well, I plan for this to only take 11 seconds. This is handled by the 2 additional classes provided by Rails. This is what you should look up if you're interested in how Rails is handling time zones. Time.zone is a class called time zone. It wraps something called TZ data, which is the world over the way to deal with time zones and their craziness. Time.zone.now is actually no longer an instance of the time class. It's wrapped by active support's time with zone. It doesn't do too many crazy things. It just allows you to alter the time. Database time is important because no matter what time, there should be a comma there, time should be stored as UTC in your database. This is non-negotiable, people. We're standardizing on this, but don't worry, it's the default in Rails because it's a best practice. Even if the application time zone is set to anything other than UTC, which is why application time matters, the value persisted to the database by default in Active Record, Rails' ORM, will be converted. You can see that here I'm setting the time zone to Central Time, US and Canada. I'm creating a new instance for right now, 7:35. I anticipated this talk would be earlier. It gets spit out as you would expect. I create some arbitrary model where I pass in time as one of its attributes. It's going to get inserted into the My Models table, and if you look closely at the end, you'll see that it's already converted to UTC at 1:35 a.m. If I access the last model, I can see it as an attribute there as well in UTC time, but if I pull out the time, it uses my application time to convert it back into the Central Standard Time Zone. You can still see it in its UTC values either by just converting it back to UTC, or if you want to get goofy with Rails' internals, you can do read attribute before typecast. I wouldn't recommend messing with those, but they're fun. So, how do I use all of this properly in my application? Thankfully, again, with Rails, it's very easy. It provides some simple defaults for working with times and converting them between them. That's why we have that time with zone class. For example, if I call that same last model, if I access its time and I call on it the method in time zone, passing in a string representation of the Eastern time zone, it'll convert it back to what's over there at 8:35 -5 UTC. To make it even more convenient, you can set a local time zone for a block of code. The following thing that I'm going to show you is often used in round actions in Rails controllers with the yield method, so that you can perform all controller actions within your current user's time zone, allowing multiple users across the world to see data that makes sense to them. Here you can see I have the time zone set to Central Time. I'm saying time use zone, passing in Eastern Time in Canada, and in my block I'm accessing that same model's time. Inside there it will be as if it's in the Eastern Time Zone, and once I get back out of the block, it's back to my application's time, which is Central Time. So let's go over some best practices for dealing with time. Say your application to UTC. This is one of those rules that you'll know if and when you should break it. And even then, just make sure. Having your application and database on the same time makes life a little bit easier. UTC timestamp is a discrete moment in time. Converting to a local time is best done at the point where the user is going to see the time. This is the final moment where their location and thus time zone can be determined. This, for most of us, would be the difference between rendering a Rails view template on the back end and throwing the HTML to the front end versus sending a time, an integer or string representation of time to the front end for a JavaScript time library to process, or a native app like iOS or Android. When working with time values, you want to use the Rails methods to save yourself. Because they're going to use the application time rather than the system's time. You can use time.current, which is just a wrapper around time.zone.now instead of time.now, which will access system time. The same goes for date.current over date.today, which we'll use again, the system's day. Finally, you want to run your time-sensitive tests, if you have any, with time frozen. Back in Rails 4.1 active support, testing introduced time helpers. This was very convenient to have this out of the box as sort of a best practice for Rails. However, it was always available through other gems, such as the fun named Time Cop, which is a terrible movie that's existed for a long time. This will save you, or you'll know that this might be the problem when tests immediately start mysteriously failing right after the clocks move forward or back, like they will on the 8th of March. So now let's go over some tips and tricks. When creating time instances, there are really three main cases you're trying to represent. There's creating the current time or date as of this moment. Sometimes you're doing this based on application logic, or sometimes you're logging when an event specifically happens. Often this is what your framework or libraries will use when they want to represent something. Again, time.current and date.current are the ways that we'll use your application's time, rather than wherever Amazon or Google or Azure, if you're a masochist, feel like putting their servers. The other thing you might want is a specific moment in time that's represented by its pieces. Time.new and date.new, just take them as they descend from slowest changing to fastest changing. So 2020 for the year, 2 for February, 25 for today, etc., and that'll give you a time or a date out of it. Again, it is best practice to specify what time zone offset as a string that you would like, if that matters, and then converting to UTC via the .utc method. Rubocop, which is a very popular Ruby linting library, will yell at you if you don't do this. It has a lot of best practices for ensuring you do call time.current over time.now, or making sure you call time.now and then converting to UTC, which is a little odd. The other way you're going to create instances of time is based off some sort of stored known format. ISO 8601, which we saw earlier, and our RFC 2822 are popular ones. They're just common ways that people represent time, usually in the year, month, day, T to indicate time, hours, minutes, seconds, time zone offset format. Or, I don't know why, but they decide to put the actual day of the week in here. It is useful. And then they do the more European time format where the day comes first instead of the month. The other thing is with Unix timestamps. These are just a specific number of ticks, not necessarily seconds, but it mostly is, since the epoch time. In this case, if you see, we just call time.at and we pass in 1,582,680,600. We get today, or maybe about like 20 minutes ago. Parsing instances is another instance where you might want time. Time.parse in the application aware time.zone.parse use a heuristic to attempt to parse a string. Here you can see that I'm passing Feb 25, 2020, 7:30 p.m. CST, and I got lucky. That works. Sometimes it won't because it's not foolproof. And in those instances, there's a string p time method, which takes in a format string. That tells the parser what values are in what location and separated by what characters. In this example, I've tried to parse 2/25/20, which is what I write in my notes all the time, and it can't figure it out because we get an argument error. However, if I give it this mysterious matrixy combination of symbols at the end, it all of a sudden knows what time it is. These are just common formatting characters, and you can find them in the Rails documentation. Once you have your time values, you probably want to output them. So you need to be able to do this in a way that makes sense to your viewers. Like string p time, this is accomplished with a format string. In the method string f time, same characters found in the documentation. I make this a little easier on myself by reading string p time as string parse time and string f time as string from time. But my gut tells me that, like back in the old Unixy days, that was string format time. Rails also takes this to another level by adding a number of common times that you would be interested in and overriding the toS method on all of your time instances so that you can pass in a very specific name for that time. You can also encode certain of those format strings into Rails so that you can name your times. This is an example of some of those that Rails would mention, T being the same time that I've been showing over and over. These are the various forms that you can do, some form of 24-hour time, database time, all the numbers jammed together, what I call European time, but they call short. Long ordinal, which just adds a TH because that's fun. And then the named formats like RFC 822, which is the same as 2822. I think 822 was an addendum to RFC 2822. And then ISO 8601, which is just the best one. So comparing time is something you'll often do to know if something is, if an event has happened before the current time or if one event has happened before another. The secret of this is, and this takes a little while to wrap your head around, computer time is just a simple count of, as I said before, the number of ticks that have transpired since an arbitrary starting date called the epoch. The Unix epoch famously is the 1st of January 1970. If you remember over the years, Facebook has commonly had errors where it would show that posts were made on December 31st, 1969. This is why, because they weren't encoding their time right, or they got a 0, showed you what would be an underflow of the epoch time. So time since the epoch is actually not relative to any time zone. It's kind of relative to universal time, but that's just the way it's defined. So anyway, the important thing is if you need time as an integer, just call 2i on it because you don't need to convert between the time zones. If I look at, again, today's date now at 8 p.m., I'm a little ahead of schedule, and I call 2i on it, I'm going to get the same value, 1,582,682,400. If I call this at 2 a.m. Tomorrow at UTC, same value. Same thing if I convert it from the central time zone, which I'm specifying to UTC, again, just the same value. They're discrete moments in time that are all equivalent. And since time is an ever-increasing integer, to compare them, you just need to use greater than or less than. Usually your language will handle this for you. Interesting, because it indicates a specific calendar day, no matter where you are in the world. Whereas a date times date can change depending on where it's created and then where it's accessed. If I were to create a timestamp in the early AM in New York on 1/1 and someone accesses it in California, it'll be seen as December 31st of the previous year. An edge case to consider is that as you're using date times, which you may want to know on what day and at what time an event occurs, don't reset the time to midnight when you're changing that day. The reason for this is you should instead set it to noon, which will give you the most flexibility for the date remaining in the same time across zones. For example, if I'm in the Eastern time zone and I change a date in whatever application I'm using and it resets it to midnight, it's going to be the previous day if I go visit, oh no, the in-laws are in Ohio, that's a different one. Anyway, if I go to, say, Texas, where I live now, right, easy example, and I'm going to see it as the previous day.
Hasta la vista, baby.
And that's my talk. Any questions? any good references to time-based movies?
I do have a question. I don't know if you know this, but when I'm setting up a new column in a database, I choose date or date time. Is there also a time option for that?
So this is actually interesting because in a computer, there really isn't a good way to represent time without a date, since times are represented by integers since the epoch. However, there is a library in Ruby that I was messing around with the other day called Time of Day, or TOD, and it has its own custom serializer for interacting with the date-time class in the database. But the advantage of something like this is that it's a very simple idea of, depending on your usage, hours, minutes, and seconds. You can persist that as a string and then make your own custom serializer in Rails to pull it out into your own time representation and or convert it into a time class. I was prepared for that one.
Yes, you were.
Can you talk to us about the next Y2K? I'm trying to remember what it's called.
The Epoch Apocalypse.
The Epocalypse.
That's what I was about to ask anyways.
The Epocalypse is, I believe, when we get to, what is it, 64-bit?
No, yeah, 64-bit integer turnover.
Yeah. I'm not too worried about that because what is it, 2038?
2033.
2033. I mean, by that time we'll have 128-bit computers. Or we'll have killed ourselves. You know, like one or the other.
I read a good
it's actually happening now, though.
Is that it started happening this year.
Yes.
Because of companies that do like funds, like manage things 20, 30 years in the future, started having their systems crash starting in January of this year.
Yeah.
I think it was actually like 2 years ago.
It was it?
Like this year it was shown that like something already happened like 2 years ago.
Yeah, maybe that's what it was.
Certain financial planning models have been screwed up by the Epocalypse, I guess, because yeah, it will eventually run out. But as we've seen in all the other big computer scares, it's not exactly going to be a major problem for most people, and those people who are already interested are probably dealing with it by just mushing two 64-bit integers together and building their own time libraries based off that. I mean,
Just to correct, it's 32 now, so they're switching to 64.
Yes.
Oh, they are switching to 64.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a 32-bit turnover.
Got it. Okay, so that's the one that we're going to, the 64-bit one,
Why
and
can't I find
that'll in general fix a lot of things. If Google can figure out how to smear a leap second over the course of 24 hours, they can figure out how to represent time in 2050.
Yeah.
The problem, though, is a lot of these financial institutions are running on code that is in itself 20 years old and cannot be updated because nobody knows. Because sometimes maybe the person who wrote it is either retired or dead.
Right.
Or just in a bunker somewhere decide to run away because he knows what's coming.
Sure. If any of those companies are watching our live stream and if Dave covers his ears, I will take a lot of money to solve these problems for you.
It's a good time to be a consultant.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. The person that I know who tweeted about this, it made a lot of money going in fixing that for that financial institution. They're like, we have this problem right now. We don't care what your rate is, what your hourly rate is. $500 an hour. Done. Come.
It's a place to be.
Because it was costing them millions of dollars.
Right.
So it was. Yeah.
What is the TPS report?
I'm not 100% sure, but I know it's a real thing. And in the 90s, it was a big bane of programmers' existence. They really hated those things. Those guys in Office Space were not just screwing around because it was fun. Nathan?
What's your take on time zones in general? Would you get rid of them if you could?
Actually, I was thinking about this because if we didn't have time zones, we'd be talking in terms of some additional format. Maybe it would be UTC, and you'd simply have like some sort of expectation of when the daylight hours would be local to your time zone, and it would be easy to reference time in other countries. But I think that as squishy humans, we really like the idea of 6 a.m. being the start of sun up and 6 p.m., for example, being the start of sundown. There's something symmetric about it. Although why it changes from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. still bothers me. Ever since I was a kid, that one was annoying.
What about daylight savings and?
I would definitely get rid of daylight savings. That's just a pain in my ass. Actually, I think Florida voted a couple years ago, like 2 or maybe 3, to get rid of daylight saving time. The problem is, when you change time zones, you have to be approved by the U.S. Congress in the United States. So they're still waiting on that, and good luck.
It actually only depends, like, if you want to change to permanent DST, then you have to get that approval. If you want to change to permanent, like, DST, then you don't have to get that approval.
Okay, see? Some people know more about time than I do.
That's because, like, Nevada, they wanted to change to permanent DST, and they couldn't do that, like, without the Congress approval, but they can still change it to the DST. But they don't want to change to the DST because then it's going to be, like, the sunset or sunrise is going to be, like, the way people don't like.
Yeah, I mean, government is in the pocket of big clock.
Have you ever seen an example where changing application time is actually the right choice?
Personally, I haven't, but if you give me a beer in 30 minutes, I could probably come up with a contrived example. In general...
Has anyone else seen?
Yeah, has anyone else? Well, we're on the topic before I start rambling again. This is your chance to stop me. Have you ever seen an example where changing the application time was a good idea? In general, Rails puts the default for your application time in UTC. Back in the day where it didn't do that, and it would just be the same as your, I forget how it was set back then, it's been a while, and a couple of hits to the head. But in general, it was a good idea to change it to UTC for that syncing between your clock and the database. However, if you do know for a fact that time zone changes are not going to affect your application, there's no reason you can't set it to be something local and then just forget about dealing with that whole transition between the front and the back end. It's just, time's already a confusing thing enough that I was able to fill a talk, so I don't know, your mileage might vary.
We did a project one time for a nonprofit here in town, and it was just easier for us at the time to say, okay, this is set to Central Time. No one's ever going to use this outside of Austin. And when they travel, they're like, hey, why did it change? I like it to always be here. So, okay, we'll set to Central Time, and that was easy. But it was super specific and super, like, a small use
So
case.
like a physically local serving website. That makes sense. Yeah.
What would happen with them when it switched between daylight saving and not?
It would just update.
Okay.
Yeah. Didn't have a big deal.
Okay.
How many states don't have DST?
I know Arizona doesn't, and there's one other, I think.
Hawaii.
Hawaii. Okay, there you
What
go.
about Hopi Nation within Arizona?
What's that?
What about Hopi Nation within Arizona?
I don't know. They may change because
They do have time.
why not be?
Basically there's a path in Arizona where you change, like you travel like 20 miles, and you switch into the DST and then out of the DST and then back into the DST and then out of the DST.
Time zones can be weird. If you look at this part of the map, you can see that the international date line is here somewhere. It's this one that like cuts around Russia because they kind of feel like it. And then all of China is actually in one time zone because in China anything is possible.
And there are other countries that have half an hour time zones.
Right, Nepal.
Right.
No, Nepal has a 45-minute adjustment, and then Iceland, for whatever reason, is grouped with all these guys in the prime meridian, but if you go south from England to France, you're also changing time zones.
And they're like 25-minute time zones. I'm like, what's the deal with that? Like 30 minutes, I understand. The 44 minutes or whatever, it's like, what's the deal with that?
People want to be difficult. And then there are some nations like Japan, which doesn't deal with time change at all. They just stay on the same time year in, year out. They seem pretty happy.
All right, so as of January 19th, there was 18 years up until Y 2038.
Okay.
That apocalypse time. It's basically people born on January 18th or 19th would be 18 when that problem happens.
So they'll never be legally adults?
Yeah.
Sucks for them. Any other questions? Yes?
So I definitely have dealt with a lot of time zone bugs at Pingboard. We have companies that have employees in the US and London and Australia, and it messes up a lot of stuff. So I was curious if there was an issue at RigUp that kind of inspired this talk, or like something that you have to work through in time zones.
So I haven't dealt with anything time zone related at RigUp specifically, but at my last position at Splitwise, that's where I uncovered the problem of changing a date and setting it to midnight being problematic. I was employed at Splitwise and using Splitwise to plan one of my best friend's bachelor party, and I put a number of expenses into the app on a particular day, and then when I flew to California, all of a sudden they were the previous day, and I was wondering, what the heck's going on here? My time zone set within the app was different than my browser, because your browser actually has the concept of local time. So if you pass a time string or time integer from the back end to the front end, of course, UTC, and then convert it without setting a specific user time zone, say from your profile JSON or whatever, it's going to use the computer's time, which is your browser's time, which is local time. And you'll see everything all of a sudden be one day earlier and think like, was I just drinking too much when I entered my expenses? Don't tell Dave about my expense reports. Anyone want to see Arnold again? I think he's the greatest American actor who's Austrian. That's a different time zone. Wasn't that a great movie with time travel? I tried to find a bunch of others, but I found only the best ones.
Primer. Primer's like the best time travel.
I don't think I've seen that one.
If you like slow, but otherwise it's really good.
Does anyone recognize this, by the way?
It's like Chrono Trigger.
Thank you. This guy wins. I don't know what he wins, but he wins knowing the best game ever. And this, kind of a giveaway.
Simpsons.
Yeah. Cool. Thank y'all.
Aaron maybe broke the record for fastest speaking talk so far.
I wasn't sure how much I was going to have to get out.
You had like an hour and a half and you did it all in 20 minutes.